On this day in 1900, a monstrous hurricane swept across Galveston, claiming over 6,000 lives. And by some estimates, as many as 12,000 people may have died on that night. It just leveled the whole island. It's known as the Great Storm of 1900. One of our viewers on YouTube was asking how far inland it went. You know, it went all the way up through the central part of the country and it swirled around to Halifax in Canada. So, I mean, it wasn't that strong then.
Right.
But
it made it to Canada.
Most Category 3 storms will last that long. And I think this probably was a Category 3. Might have been a Category 4. Galveston story, of course, did not end there. It was just totally destroyed. But the raising of the island, which I think is where Offutt's Bayou comes from. They used mud from there. That's right by Moody Gardens. You know, there's a big water area where the paddle wheeler was. That's where they got the mud to raise the island 17 feet. They also, of course, constructed the seawall, which is part of what the Guinness World Record was for the longest, walkway in the country. 10 miles or more. So they did that. The Corps of Engineers came in. They did a lot. So let's talk about Galveston before and after the storm, how the city's continued to adapt and rebuild and persevere. We have Will Wright with us again, Chief Creative Officer for the Galveston Historical Foundation. Welcome.
Hi, good to see you all again.
Thank you.
You know, if folks want to join into the conversation and talk to Will and us, 713-440-8870. I hear Frank talk about the story about the raising of the island, and I think about all the buildings that were lifted. And by today's standards, that would be a massive undertaking. Go back 125 years where we were with technology and the ability to do these things. Just mind-blowing what they did.
It's an incredible part of the story. It's brute force, right? It's just physically lifting the island. It's an incredible piece of it.
So when we talk about lifting the island, what are we actually saying? That they just filled land more to make the island taller in a sense, and then we think of all the buildings being raised? So talk to me about what actually
So there's
happened.
kind of two components to it. We have the seawall component, which we all are very familiar with, and then you've got the grade raising of the island. And that was lifting houses up, getting them above a floodplain, and then filling them in with dredge material from that. It was a 6-7 year process. They did it in kind of blocks or quadrants, but all of it was to try to get these houses up off sea level. And it's one of many reasons why we are so lucky to have such a wealth of architectural structures still there that have survived it.
And so now that we're back and we're looking at this, 125 years ago, also what was happening in regards to communication about the storm that was coming? What did people know and what did people not know? What did that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say all this with Frank in here. So my amateur
Don't worry, he'll correct
meteorology,
you if you're wrong.
Please, by all stretch. It was different, right? We're so used to weather being everywhere. It's on your phone. It's in your car. It's it's part of the daily life. That wasn't necessarily the case then. So there were reports that there was a storm in the Gulf. They thought there might be some rain or something of that nature. They did not expect a hurricane to be coming. They did not expect what was going to happen by any stretch. So it caught people unaware. It caught people just thinking that this was going to be a much different experience than what it turned out to be. The hurricane came in the evening at night, so you got that factor added onto it where it's dark, right? So you're in the middle of dark. You're now dealing with water and wind and waves, and it turned into just a absolutely horrific scene. And then, when the sun comes up the next morning, you were looking around to see the actual devastation that's there, trying to figure out, who's alive, who isn't, you account for friends and family members. It had to have been just an absolutely horrible moment.
Well, and they tried to take bodies and send them out to sea. They kept washing back in.
Correct. Yeah. So there were, dealing with the dead was, it's a public health issue as well at that point, right? And services weren't there. So yes, there were different ways they tried to do that. They did take some bodies out. They floated back. They ended up doing mass cremations on the island. So lots of different, one piece of many things of trying just to get the island
Claire
able
Barton
to
came.
live again.
Claire
Yeah,
Barton
absolutely.
So
Big piece to it.
when you look at the history of Galveston and you look at pre-storm and after storm, do you think Galveston's identity, how much of this storm is wrapped up in today's Galveston?
Yeah, I think it's arguably, along with Juneteenth, one of Galveston's most defining moments. Galveston before 1900 was a very wealthy city. It was one of the wealthiest cities in the United States. It was leading the nation in commerce. You had a lot of firsts there. You had the first telephone, you had electricity, you had gas plumbing. You had all these things that were happening there pre-1900. And it wasn't just because, hey, let's go do this in Galveston. It's because Galveston was a momentum that was happening. So well known, and you see that also occur, the response to it after the 1900 storm. It wasn't just a Texas story, it was a national story. People knew about Galveston. And you were able to see, the Claire Barton thing. This news was getting out there in the weeks to follow of what was happening and how do we get there to help everyone.
Who thought of a seawall?
The idea, I can't tell you who thought of it, but the idea was there before the 1900 storm. It took the 1900 storm to put it into motion, and it happened really quick. So the seawall started in 1904. So within 4 years after the storm, during the rebuilding efforts, they are now actively moving forward on that construction of the seawall. And it was done in different sections and time frames, but that first one started in 1904 and ended in 1911, and then we had a hurricane in 1915, right? So it
worked.
You got a lesson really quick: is this seawall going to work or not work? And it did.
Yeah.
So I often wonder, a lot of people, I'm sure, left. Those that stayed, what was it about them that made them say, we're not just staying, we're going to lift the island, we're going to build this seawall because we're invested in this? Who were those people?
Yeah, and this goes back a little bit to your question earlier. It becomes part of Galveston's resilience story, right? Many places would be hit with that kind of destruction and not be able to come back from it. Right. I would suggest that part of that was due to the economic prosperity of the island. You had a lot of commercial interests there. You had a lot of business interests there. You had a lot of wealth there. So you might have had some ability to, after that storm, to say, you know what, we can get through this. We have the resources here. We have the ability to rebuild. And then that resilience kind of starts coming back up repeatedly because, we're not a stranger to hurricanes.
Well, a lot of people don't know the story of Indianola down by Matagorda Bay. And so they were hit by a hurricane in, 1879?
Twice? Is that
and
correct?
Then 1889 did them in. And they were hit twice. And they were like, we're done.
We're out.
Yeah, we're out.
People often forget just how big I think Galveston is. You tend to think of it as that area you come off the drive into, and there's the historic district and the seawall, and there's Galveston, but there's a lot more. Right. How much was devastated on the island?
The population of Galveston at that time was around 35 to 38,000 people. Structure-wise, you can hear people will say that the island was totally destroyed. It wasn't. We would say about a third of the buildings were destroyed. So you had a lot that still survived, which we benefit from today.
When you say building, do you mean house also?
Houses, commercial buildings, okay. Yes, absolutely. The death, as Frank said earlier, there's no definitive number to that. You'll see 6,000. We say 6,000 to 8,000. You can see 15,000. You'll never know, right? It was the sheer magnitude of the loss of life was just staggering. So you look at a population of 36,000, you lost 6,000 of that already. Devastating story, devastating moment.
And I'm assuming that was the night that it happened.
Sure.
How much did we lose of life after the fact?
I don't know how that all breaks down in the days to go from that. The bridge was cut out, so in addition to just dealing with the moment of it, you now have no infrastructure to get aid in, right? So ships were coming in to bring in food and water. One of the first priorities was to try to build the railroad back, the train back, so you can get more, aid in. So lots of things trying to happen pretty quickly.
You're listening to Hello Houston. We are speaking with Will Wright about the Great Storm of 1900, the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history, and how the city rebuilt after the tragedy. You can join the conversation at 713-440-8870. We do have a call from Amy Chase, Bolivar Lighthouse from Galveston.
Hi, Amy.
Hello, Frank. How are you?
I'm good. It's nice to hear your voice. Tell us about the Bolivar Lighthouse and what it did for the people of Bolivar on that fateful night 125 years ago.
Yeah, Frank. So there were 125 brave souls that rode out the 1900 storm inside the lighthouse. Wow. The famous Gulf and Interstate train had left Beaumont that morning at 7 a.m. They say there roughly were 100 passengers on that train and crew on board as the train was rolling down the tracks. And as the storm surge started to rise, they say there's 9 brave souls that waited off that train and waded through waist-deep water to get inside the lighthouse. And those were the only 9 members that survived that train ride. It's been neat. We've met several grandparents, children, the grandparents and great-grandparents that rode out the storm in the 1900s. And one of them, he said his great-grandmother was 3 years old living back in Port Bolivar, and they basically swam her in. And the family talks about the noises and how scary, and the tower swayed back and forth. And this gentleman said, Amy, he said, you realize if my great-grandmother wouldn't have ridden out the storm inside the lighthouse, I wouldn't be here today, which is really incredible. And another story is, as a lady called me up and said, I've got to tell you a story, but my grandmother was living on the peninsula. My grandfather was living on the peninsula, and both sought shelter inside the lighthouse. And they met sitting on the stairwell because they sat 2 by 2 on the stairwell. And as they met, they ended up getting married 2 years later in 1902 and going on to have 5 children. And she still has the family estate. So they talk about Keeper Harry Claiborne and his wife Virginia, and how amazing he was to bring all these refugees into the lighthouse. They say that they took buckets at the top of the lighthouse, which is 117 feet tall, to try and catch rainwater. And they said there was so much salt in the rainwater from the storm, and he used the provisions. And because of all of his heroic duties, in 1999, the U.S. Coast Guard recognized his faithful service, and with the namesake of a 175-foot Keeper Class Buoy tender that's stationed in Galveston. If you all take the ferry boat from Galveston over to Bolivar, if you look over in the right, you may see the Keeper Claiborne for all of his heroic services that he did during the 1900 storm to save those 125 lives, because they do say when the storm passed and the door opened and they walked out, they said it was like a scene from a Civil War battlefield. There were dozens of bodies that surrounded the lighthouse, testifying those who had tried and failed to get in to the safety of the tower that night.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's something. A lot of people don't know, Amy owns the Bolivar Lighthouse. A lot of people don't realize that it's owned. It's not just sitting there. And I know that you've been in a year's process of restoring it. Give us a quick rundown. How are you getting there? Or you have
We
years
sure
more?
are. So the 501c3 nonprofit was started in 2015. So just to clarify, the families have leased the tower to the nonprofit. The nonprofit has all the authority and ability for the fundraising effort. So the first thing we did was a stabilization test to test the anchor bolts and the rods to make sure that everything was safe and secure, and 100% it is, which is truly amazing over 152 years later. In May 15th, we took down the crown. If y'all know, that was very delicate and fragile. And then we have the new cast iron door that was restored last year by the famous Doug McLean here in Galveston. And then if anybody's come and seen, the exterior has been repainted back to its black and white day marks for the first time in over 75 years, and it is absolutely glorious and beautiful. We just did the work with dry blasting and painting the inside of the stairwell and the staircase. And we're raising the money right now to have the crown refabricated. So we just started our step sponsor campaign yesterday, since there were 125 lives that bravely rode out that storm. And we've got 135 steps in there. So if you go to our website, bolivarpointlighthouse.org, you can follow our progress and learn how you could sponsor a step or sponsor a brick, and how you can help our campaign in getting this lighthouse restored and open to the public, because we cannot wait to welcome guests and visitors in to come in and take a tour of the lighthouse and see so much history that's played a part in Galveston Bay in Houston over 152 years.
Okay. Amy, thank you for calling in. I think probably some people learned a little bit they didn't know.
Yeah.
My best to your family, by the way. So, Will, we're talking about obviously the Bolivar Lighthouse is still there. And you said, a lot of buildings did survive. What are some of the more, I guess, prominent buildings that you could think of offhand?
Absolutely. So that story is a great example of, places being shelters as well. Bishop's Palace is a great example of that. It was built in 1892 by the Greshams. They opened the doors for people to come in, get in the house. It's made of stone. They felt like this house isn't going to go anywhere. It didn't go anywhere. And it became a safe space as well. You've got a ton of houses there in the East End Historic District that are pre-1900 homes. You've got Moody Mansion, you've got the Menard House, you've got very identifiable houses that are associated with Galveston that are still there today.
And everybody, if you have a house that survived it, you proudly display a plaque. Where does that come from?
Yeah, absolutely. So it comes from Galveston Historical Foundation, and the plaques were part of the 100th anniversary commemoration of it. So in 2000, the program was initiated that if you have a storm survivor house, and we vet it to make sure that it hasn't been significantly altered or anything like that, you can apply to have a plaque put on your house. We expanded that a little bit this year with some yard signs, so there's a little bit more of a visual representation.
Now, well, you talked about, you described Galveston as this hustling and bustling type city with lots of first. Do you feel like it reached that type of momentum post-storm? And how long did it take to rebuild?
I don't think it did. I think the Galveston of pre-storm Galveston was the kind of apex of that commercial, piece of it. That's not to say it hasn't had tremendous successes since then, but it definitely was a change in tone from it. The rebuilding of it was there. The industry is still there. The commercial aspect of it's still there, but a lot of changes from that.
In today's politics, all we hear about is the infighting, the polarization, and all of that. When you look back and you talk about what happened after the storm, and it sounds like people had to come together and be on the same page. Do we have records of infighting and battling and stuff like we see today, or did everyone buy into this is what we need to do?
I don't know. You see the Ike Dike conversations now, and we're so far away from Hurricane Ike in that discussion. And I think it's really kind of a sobering thought to look back at the 1900 storm, and within 4 years, the seawall was going, right? So, boy, I'm sure that there were people that wanted a different version of something, but I think it really speaks to this community momentum that we need to get this there. We need to start building immediately. It's so fast to have moved on that project.
Amazing.
Yeah, Cosme Garcia, watching us on YouTube, says that after the storm, the city and county of Galveston appointed a board of engineers to recommend how to protect the city. Final report was submitted January 25th, 1902. Yeah. And then I guess they commenced in 1904 with, was the Army Corps of Engineers called that back then?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so they started it in the 1911. Also, the Galvez Hotel was finished in 1911. So my point being that the people that were behind this, Ernie, they really wanted to make a splash.
But I just can't imagine in today's day and age people coming together like that and doing to save a community the way they did back then. And I think we could all learn something from that about when there's need in a community, it supersedes all of this little infighting we have and coming together. I do want to mention someone sent us a text that said that there's a wonderful book about the 1900 Galveston storm, Isaac's Storm, by Eric Larson. He also did Devil in the White City, that book. It's a superb, exciting read and a great historical documentation of the storm and its aftermath while bringing in the human experience, and they highly recommend it, which reminds me of some of the events you folks have been doing down in Galveston to commemorate the storm, that there's a book gathering of people's firsthand accounts of what they went through that night.
Yeah, there's multiple books on it. Isaac's Storm is obviously one of the better known ones about it. I was doing a lecture or a presentation to some a presentation to some 6-year-olds, and I said, it feels very cinematic to me when I tell this story or I share these things, but it is cinematic, right? It has all these qualities of this thing happening that we don't know about and what the people's reactions were to it. The documentation, the oral history, the recordings of it, all become part of that larger narrative. And it's something we still see today. We hear it there. We see it online or anytime we talk about it. People saying, well, my family made it through the storm, or my grandfather made it through the storm. People have and continue to have just such a close connection to that story and that storm. It always is a popular topic when we have a chance to.
What strikes you? You're a historian. What strikes you as the real standout of the 1900 storm?
I really like the juxtaposition of some of it. You had this monumental, absolutely horrific event, and you had this response of almost of an equal scale. You've got the largest natural disaster in U.S. history, and then a few short years later, you have the largest civil engineering project in United States history. I think that just speaks on so many levels to I've said momentum before, but the momentum, the effort, the intensity of a community really coming together. And I really just, that resonates really strongly with me. And I think you see that again and again and again through Galveston in how we've weathered the storm, literally and figuratively. But boy, that you have those things on both sides of this really just Herculean story.
Will, what's your personal history with the island?
I've been in Galveston for about 18 years. I grew up outside of Amarillo, so I came from no water to a lot of water. And yeah, it's, I've worked with GHF for about 14 years now, and it's been a really good place to be. I love the history. I've always appreciated history. Galveston, the more you learn about it, the more you find out that it is a weird place. I mean that in all the best ways. It's a quirky place. A lot of connections into Galveston, looking at history, not only local, but across the United States, across the world.
Full of ghosts.
Lots of ghosts down there, lots of stories, lots of ways to interact with it too.
30 seconds left. What would you tell people to take away from this story? What do you want them to know and to feel as they move forward in life?
I think, today of all days being the anniversary of it, I think taking a moment just to kind of acknowledge the loss of life is pretty significant. That has always been part of it. It's not just about the rebuilding. It's not just about the resilience. Those are huge pieces of it. But you had such a huge loss of life that 125 years later, the fact that we're able to sit here and talk about that's pretty remarkable.
Will Wright is the Chief Creative Officer for the Galveston Historical Foundation. Will, thanks for joining us today on Hello
Thank you
Houston.
all very much.